Do you want to learn how you can automatically generate your Swagger documentation for your serverless APIs? In this video, that is exactly what I'm going to be showing you how to do. Hi guys, my name is Sam with Complete Coding, where our aim is to make you into the best serverless and AWS developer that you can be. In this video, we'll be looking at how we can set up a NPM package and a serverless plugin that will allow us to automatically generate Swagger documentation for our serverless API. Full disclosure, this is an NPM package that I have built myself because I hate doing documentation. It takes time out, and if you do it manually, it always ends up that the documentation and what you've actually built don't quite match up. So with this serverless plugin, it uses your original serverless config to generate your Swagger UI config. Creating this plugin has taken me weeks and weeks. So the best way you can say thanks is if you smash the like button on this video, as it helps this be shared with more developers just like yourselves. So let's jump into our code and see how we can get things set up. So I've just opened up a serverless project that I've created a little while ago, and this is based off the serverless template called AWS Node.js-TypeScript. So this is going to be very familiar to any of you who have used the TypeScript template. To start with, let's have a look at our serverless.ts. So in here we have our custom section full of variables that we use throughout our project. We then have our provider and our list of plugins. As well as that, we then have our functions, and I've defined those in a separate file. And if we have a look at those, currently we have two functions, a get flights with a single HTTP method, as well as book flights, which has a post method. So to get our serverless auto-swagger working, first we need to install it. We do that by running npm install --dev serverless auto swagger. And whilst that is starting, I'm going to copy the serverless auto swagger. I'm going to head over to our serverless.ts file and find our plugins list. Now, if you're using any of these plugins, so serverless webpack, serverless offline, or serverless DynamoDB local, then you need to make sure that you put the serverless auto swagger before those. That's because the serverless auto swagger does a couple of small changes, especially to the serverless offline package. So it gets processed in order. And if you want this to work, just make sure that is right at the very start. Now that we've done that, we can save this file. We can see that the npm installation has finished. And now there is one little thing that we need to do, because if you're using the serverless webpack plugin with TypeScript, we need to go into the webpack config.js, and inside the resolve.extensions, we just need to add one little thing, which is .js. Now that is because at the moment, the way that this works is it actually generates a JavaScript file, and that's so that this project will be compatible with both if you use serverless YAML, and this project does work with serverless YAML, or if you've used serverless.ts, as we have done in this case. If you're not using Webpack, you can forget about this step, and hopefully there'll be a new version of the serverless auto swagger where you don't require this change to your Webpack config. But for now we do, and once that is installed, all we need to do in our terminal is run serverless offline start. And as I said before, there is a little bit of processing that the auto-swagger plugin does before the serverless offline gets triggered. And that is to generate on our left-hand side this folder called Swagger. And this contains the code required to actually host and basically serve our Swagger UI endpoint. Now that has finished running, we can see we have the two endpoints that we expect to see, the get flights and the post to flights to update it. But we also have a get Swagger, and I'm just going to copy that. And it also has a swagger.json, and that is going to be an endpoint to serve the JSON. So if you have your own Swagger UI hosted somewhere, you can just access that URL. So if we head over to a browser and open up the port 3000 dev Swagger, we get now access to our Swagger UI, which honestly is really cool. This has been generated dynamically from the config inside our functions. And if we click on here, we can see that we have a get request and a post request, where the post request requires a flight ID string parameter, but that's all the details there are. Now, the really cool thing is when we want to update our API. So if we go back into our code and just kill the offline mode for now and go into our functions, we have our get flights and our book flights. I'm going to just very quickly copy the get flights and paste it at the bottom and do a fake API, and let's call this fake get. We're going to have that triggering the same Lambda, but obviously if you are creating a new Lambda endpoint, you would point it at the new code. It's still going to be a get, and I'm going to change the path to be fake. If we save this and rerun our serverless offline start, what we'll see is the fact that we've changed this and added an extra path for our API. So once this gets generated into our Swagger JSON, it will then be able to be served and we'll see our updated API. So this is just starting up inside serverless offline. And now that has completed, if we refresh the page, what will happen is we'll see that we have this new endpoint. This just means that as long as you have updated your original serverless config, the changes will be continued and will be available inside the Swagger UI, which means that your API documentation and what is available will never be out of sync. So if we want to have more on our API documentation than just a 200 response, say, for example, we want to add what kind of data is going to be returned. Inside our functions, we can find our HTTP event and add another parameter of responses. This is an object where we put the status code we want to return, and then in here that is an object describing the response. So first we have a description. This description could be successful API response, and let's just make sure I've typed successful correctly. As well as a description, there can also be a body type. So body type, and this is going to be a string pointing at the response type, so the TypeScript type that is returned as part of this. So in our case, if we look into source and types, there is this flights.d.ts. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to return flight. Just like that. Now, in this case, with the serverless auto-swagger, the first place it looks for is API types.ts. So in this case, it won't look in the flights file. So there are two ways of dealing with this. One is to change it from flights.d.ts to API-types, and that will work absolutely fine. The other way is if we add a little bit of extra config to our serverless custom section. The way that we do that is in our custom section, we add a new variable called auto-swagger, and in this object we can define a couple of things. The one we want to define is the type files, and this is an array of strings pointing at the TypeScript definition files that we want to use. In our case, that is going to be a single file of /source/types/flights.d.ts. And if you have multiple different TypeScript definition files that all export different variables that you want to use inside your Swagger, then you can just add multiple files in here. If we save this and rerun our auto Swagger, so just a reminder, we've set the type files, and in our responses, well, we've added responses to our get flights with a body type of flight. We can now rerun serverless offline start. So now that that has finished compiling, we can go back into our browser and refresh this Swagger URL. And what will happen is we now have some models. So this flights model contains all of the information about a flight, as well as if we look on our get endpoint, it says that a 200 response has a description of successful API response, and then has an example of the model data. This just means that now you never have to define the models for your Swagger UI. You can just pull them dynamically from the TypeScript definition files that you've already created. So this works for a get where you define the response code. So here you have a response code with a description and then the TypeScript type of the response. But what about a post request? So if we look at book flights, we can do something similar on here. We can define the body type and call this post flight body. And now what we need to do is copy this, head into our flights.d.ts, and in here export interface post flight body, and in here we can post whatever we need to in our type. So in this example, let's say we have a passengers, which is going to be an array of passenger, and then there is going to be a flight time, and that is going to be a string. So if we save this flights.d.ts and make sure that functions.ts is also saved, it will now create a new Swagger UI when we restart serverless offline, but it will say that the body that is required on this post request is going to have the type of post flight body. Again, this takes a little second to create our documentation. So over in our browser, we can just refresh the page. So now that we've loaded this up, we can see there is a post flight body defining the parameters that need to be passed into the post. And if we actually open up the post itself, we can see that that is defined here, and we can switch between the model and the example values for this request. So with this, I've now shown you everything you need to set up auto-swagger in either a serverless.ts or just a normal serverless project, and add things such as post body definitions, as well as responses for any requests that return a response. Of course, you can add more responses than just one. I would expect there to be multiple different responses for each of the API endpoints that you create. At least one for success and one for failure. So as well as being able to run this locally and see your Swagger locally, if you were to run SLS deploy, it will actually deploy not only your APIs that you have created, but also the Swagger endpoints, so that you can make the Swagger config that you've defined and your documentation publicly accessible. If we head over to our browser, and I'm going to paste in the link to a deployed version of the API that I created a little while ago, we can see that this contains the get flights and the book flights. And now every time I do another serverless deploy, it will then update this whole documentation, meaning that the deployed version of your system and the documentation for it are always in line. In this video, we've looked at how we can automatically generate our own Swagger UI from our own serverless config using the serverless-auto-swagger plugin. If you like this and you think you might use it in your own projects, then make sure to give this video a like, as creating this plugin took weeks of time, and it's a great way of saying thank you to the developers. And if you haven't done already, make sure to subscribe down here and turn on the bell notification, as we release serverless content regularly to help you become the best serverless developer that you can be. So thank you, and I'll see you in that next video.